PS2 Fishing Rod. In the early 2000s, Sony leaned into realism with one of the strangest accessories on the PlayStation 2, the Fishing Rod controller. Built for Fisherman's Bass Club and a handful of other fishing titles, this accessory wasn't a plastic gimmick. It had motion sensors, a reel you could actually crank, and vibration feedback meant to simulate the tug of a hooked fish. Sony believed fans would appreciate a more immersive way to cast and reel. The controller worked by translating rod movements into in-game actions. Cast your line with a flick of the wrist, crank the reel with the handle, and feel rumble as the bass fought back. In theory, it should have been a unique, fun way to combine arcade fishing cabinets and home gaming. Unfortunately, it was poorly supported, and almost no developers outside of Sega Bass Fishing clones bothered to integrate it. Despite being niche, it became one of those accessories that perfectly defines the weird accessory era. Highly specific, surprisingly well built, but destined to sit in closets once the novelty wore off. Today, it's remembered more as a quirky collectible than a useful controller. NES Power Glove. Few gaming accessories are as infamous as the Power Glove for the NES. Released in 1989 by Mattel, it promised the future of motion control decades before the Wii. The concept was simple but bold. Strap on a cyberpunk-looking glove, wave your hand in the air, and control your NES with gestures. It looked futuristic, complete with buttons on the forearm and wires connecting to ultrasonic sensors you had to set up around your TV. The reality, though, was far less magical. The glove was notoriously inaccurate. Games often failed to register motions, leaving players flailing helplessly. Only two titles, Super Glove Ball and Bad Street Brawler, were designed specifically for it, while other games technically worked, but with laughable responsiveness. Still, its impact can't be overstated. The Power Glove became iconic after appearing in the 1989 movie The Wizard, where a young villain declared the now legendary line, "I love the Power Glove, it's so bad." Critics hated it, gamers abandoned it, but collectors in pop culture never forgot it. The Power Glove may have been a failure, but it paved the way for the dream of motion gaming that resurfaced decades later. Sega Genesis Activator. In 1993, Sega tried to leap into the future of motion control with the Activator. Shaped like an octagonal ring you placed on the floor, the device used infrared beams to detect movement. Players were supposed to stand inside, punch or kick through the beams, and watch their Genesis characters mimic the motions. It was a full-body controller years before the Kinect or VR headsets. It turned out to be a nightmare. The infrared sensors were overly sensitive and often misread basic movements. A punch might register as a kick, or nothing at all, leaving players wildly flailing without much success. Even worse, only a small number of games supported it directly, and most of them weren't exactly designed for physical combat. Playing Mortal Kombat with the Activator sounded awesome, but in reality, it was exhausting and nearly unplayable. The Activator retailed at nearly $80, which was expensive for an accessory in the early 90s. Its bulky design, frustrating setup, and lack of game support doomed it quickly. Today, it's seen less as a functional product and more as Sega's bold but failed attempt to push gaming into the future before the technology was ready. Leave a like and subscribe if you've ever used any of these before. DK Bongos. Launched alongside Donkey Konga, the DK Bongos turned the GameCube into a living room drum kit. Donkey Konga shipped often bundled with the twin drum controller, and had you hit left, right, or both drums and clap to match on-screen rhythms, mixing Nintendo tunes with licensed tracks. Nintendo then did something wild. Donkey Kong Jungle Beat reimagined a platformer around the bongos, left and right hits to move, both drums to jump, and clapping to unleash a shockwave, turning a game into percussion. It felt very performative, and critics praised the audacity even when the novelty became a hassle. Official support stayed narrow, but that tight catalog didn't stop the bongos from becoming an icon of Nintendo weirdness. Donkey Konga itself sold around 1.2 million copies worldwide, proving the concept had real reach even if the accessory never went truly mainstream. Today, the DK Bongos live on as a beloved curiosity, and a favorite for challenge runs and party chaos. Resident Evil Chainsaw. When Resident Evil 4 launched in 2005, it already stood out as a bold reinvention of the franchise. But Capcom and Newbie Tech decided to take it one step further with one of the strangest controllers ever made, the Resident Evil Chainsaw controller. Shaped like a bloody, jagged chainsaw, this thing looked straight out of a horror movie prop shop. Released for both the PlayStation 2 and GameCube, each version even had a different color scheme, yellow for PS2, blood red for GameCube. Functionally, it was awkward. The buttons and sticks were embedded into the sides of the chainsaw, forcing players to hold it with an uncomfortable grip. Trying to play a fast-paced shooter with a bulky piece of plastic designed to resemble a weapon wasn't exactly easy, yet that was part of its strange appeal. It wasn't made to be practical, it was made to be memorable. Only 50,000 units were produced, instantly turning it into a collector's item. While most players shelved it after a few awkward sessions, it still perfectly captured the spirit of Resident Evil, campy, over the top, and willing to lean into spectacle. As a piece of gaming history, it's more art piece than controller, and fans wouldn't have it any other way. NES Rob. In 1985, Nintendo needed a way to sell the NES in North America during a time when retailers wanted nothing to do with video game consoles after the market crash. Their solution? A robot. The Robotic Operating Buddy, better known as Rob, wasn't marketed as a video game accessory, it was marketed as a toy. Standing about 10 inches tall, Rob connected to the NES and could physically move its arms to interact with special objects on screen. The robot worked with only two games, Gyromite and Stack Up. Using spinning gyros and colored platforms, Rob slowly manipulated pieces while the player watched. In theory, it was futuristic and charming. In reality, it was painfully slow, unresponsive, and more of a novelty than a serious controller. Still, it accomplished its main goal. It got the NES onto store shelves by convincing retailers that it wasn't just another video game system. Although Rob was quickly forgotten, Nintendo kept him alive as a mascot of sorts. He's appeared as a playable fighter in Super Smash Bros. And even shows up in games like Mario Kart DS. More than a controller, Rob is a reminder of how Nintendo saved the console industry with creativity, even if the robot itself didn't last. U-Force. In 1989, Broderbund introduced the U-Force, a controller for the NES that looked more like a laptop opened on its side than a gamepad. It relied on infrared sensors across two flat panels, which detected hand movements in midair. The pitch was simple. No buttons, no joysticks, just wave your hands like you were in the future. Advertisements promised precise motion control years before that term even meant anything in gaming. The reality, however, was brutal. The sensors were incredibly unreliable, often failing to register even simple commands. A punch might miss entirely, or a carefully timed motion would be ignored. Players often had to wave their arms wildly just to get the system to recognize inputs, which quickly turned from exciting to exhausting. The U-Force technically supports dozens of NES games, from Mike Tyson's Punch-Out to Super Mario Bros., but none were actually designed for it. That meant the control experience ranged from clunky to downright unplayable. Critics slammed it, players abandoned it, and it quickly joined the ranks of what were they thinking accessories. Today, the U-Force is remembered as one of the most ambitious but least functional accessories in gaming history. Perfect snapshot of the late 80s obsession with futuristic gimmicks that technology simply couldn't back up yet. Laser Scope. In 1990, Konami released one of the strangest accessories for the NES, the Laser Scope. It looked like a futuristic headset with a built-in microphone and crosshair eyepiece. The idea was ambitious. Strap it on, aim with your head, and simply shout fire to shoot enemies in games like Laser Invasion. Hands-free gaming before anyone even imagined VR. The reality, however, was a comedy of errors. The microphone was far too sensitive, meaning it didn't just respond to the word fire. Any loud noise, talking, sneezing, even your mom yelling from the kitchen, could trigger the gun. That made gameplay chaotic and unpredictable. Added to that was the discomfort of wearing a plastic headset for hours, and the experience was more headache than innovation. Despite these flaws, the Laser Scope worked with all Zapper-compatible NES games, which gave it at least some functionality beyond its launch title. But the truth was clear. It was more trouble than it was worth. Most players used it once, laughed at the absurdity, and went back to the trusty Zapper. Today, the Laser Scope is remembered as a relic of early voice control attempts, an accessory that promised immersion but mostly delivered accidental chaos. Game Boy Pocket Sonar. In 1998, Bandai released one of the most unexpected Game Boy accessories ever, the Pocket Sonar. Instead of being a quirky controller, this device was a legitimate fishing tool. Plugging into the Game Boy's cartridge slot, it came with a sonar transducer that you dropped into the water. The screen would then display underwater readings, detecting fish, showing water depth, and even mapping the bottom of a lake or river. Essentially, the Game Boy doubled as a portable fish finder. It wasn't just a utility though. The cartridge also included a small fishing game and an encyclopedia about real-world fish species, so if you weren't by the water, you could still practice fishing on your handheld. In Japan, where recreational fishing was hugely popular, this hybrid of gaming and practical tech actually made sense, but outside of Japan, the idea of hauling your Game Boy onto a fishing trip was bizarre. Unsurprisingly, it never saw international release. It remained a niche curiosity, overshadowed by more conventional items. Yet the Pocket Sonar stands out as one of the rare times a console accessory genuinely crossed into the real world, merging play with practicality in a way few others ever attempted. Neji-Con. In the mid-90s, Namco unveiled one of the strangest yet most innovative controllers for the original PlayStation, the Neji-Con. Unlike standard controllers, the Neji-Con was built specifically for racing games. At first glance, it looked like a normal gamepad split down the middle, but the magic was in the hinge. Players could actually twist the two halves of the controller to steer, providing a degree of analog precision that D-pads simply couldn't offer. Paired with titles like Ridge Racer and Wipeout, the Neji-Con gave players an incredibly smooth level of control, especially in an era when the default controller only offered digital inputs. Some racing fans swore it was the best way to play, long before Sony's dual analog and DualShock controllers became standard. But while it was ahead of its time in design, it never gained mainstream traction. The learning curve was steep. The hinge felt strange to casual players, and support was limited to a relatively small library of racing titles. Today, the Negicon is remembered as both bizarre and brilliant. It didn't stick around, but it showed how far developers were willing to go in experimenting with hardware. A weird-looking relic, sure, but one that quietly shaped the future of controller design. Which accessories did you use for games? Let me know in the comments. Thanks for watching.